What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my retrospective review for Fable 2. Ahead of the series reboot slated for next year in 2025, I wanted to take a look back at the original trilogy to see how they stood up against my memory of what those games were when I played them back in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Now, Fable 2 in particular, though, is a little bit interesting because if you follow the channel much, you'll know that this is a PC channel, and Fable 2 is actually a console exclusive. It only ever released on the Xbox 360 properly. Nowadays, as of a few years ago, it is possible to stream it to PC directly through Game Pass if you want to get it legitimately, and then I believe there's also like emulators and things, but otherwise you can also get it simply on Xbox One and Xbox X and S just straight up through their store, at least digitally. All of that to tell you that I had to stream this one to my PC, which is a bit of a rare exception for me as, again, PC channel and all, but certainly something to keep in mind as we move through this. Which brings us to an overview. So right away, I would say Fable 2 is more of an action-adventure than it is anything else. There's some light RPG elements, there's some fun ways you can interact with the world and everything, but it also took a lot away from even the game's roots with the original title, such as reining in what was available magic-wise, and clearly designing the game for a console release, as it was only ever released there to begin with, which meant fundamentally changing a few things about how combat worked in relation to melee, ranged, or magic even. And while the series did, with this entry, cut away at some of those mechanics and the little bit of depth they did have, they at the same time did expand a lot of other areas, such as how you could interact with the world, even going so far as to cause a bit of a time skip in a couple places throughout the game, which fundamentally changed some of the maps you could go back to and explore, and stuff like that was fun to go back and see for myself. But I would say on the whole, as far as my memory goes, I remembered this one being my least favorite, and that's primarily for the removal of some of the more RPG-oriented aspects, like, for instance, things like the armor rating on your actual armor. There is no armor in Fable 2, really, as it's all purely cosmetic. So long story short, I think there are a few different ways in which my memory was unkind to Fable 2. I think it was a little bit better than I had remembered it to be, but there are other places where I was like, oh yes, I did in fact hate this thing for this reason. And I want to get into all of that over the course of this one. Starting first with the technical state. So right away, again, I streamed this, so it's really hard to give much of a definitive this is how it's running analysis, but most of what I want to mention here is what I already mentioned. It's an Xbox exclusive. If you're on PC, you can stream it via Game Pass. Otherwise, you can download it onto an Xbox One or Xbox Series X and S. Now, outside of those things, though, there are still a few persistent bugs that simply are never going to get fixed at this point, let's be honest, such as the fact that the inventory takes a second to update when you use an item, so if you're quick enough, you can actually use multiple things from your inventory, even if it's the same item more than once, before it actually falls away. Most commonly used to abuse the game's experience potions. Not that it's terribly necessary, but you can definitely do it. And then there are a handful of quests that can break depending on when you do them, like before or after the main story. So generally speaking, if you sit down to do a quest, it's best to simply do all of it at once rather than do part of it and then come back to it later, as that's the kind of thing that is likely to lead you into bugs. But I would say that's just about everything to know about it on a technical level. So let's move on to the story setup and my thoughts on it. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire narrative here, honestly, just because it's incredibly short, but also because I have covered the first game already, and I forgot just how much this game copies that first game's story. So many of the story beats are almost identical. From how you start the game as a child, running through a quick tutorial of the game's mechanics, of course, but it also simply sees you gathering some gold to buy something, exactly like you did in the first game. There's a prison sequence where you become imprisoned for a set amount of time, though at least in this game's case, it uses that opportunity to perform a time skip and change the world around you. And there's even an arena that is mandatory for you to go through to gain a lot of your initial fame, so to speak, and it simply mirrors the first game way too much in a way that feels kinda ridiculous, to be honest. Let's talk a little bit about what is unique. So as this is the second game, believe it or not, this one takes place about 600 or so years after the original title, during which, and mostly as a consequence of the original game, you stopping the big bad saw people finally being fed up with the Guild of Heroes that fielded all of these sort of almost superhuman monstrosities that we ourselves count among our number as the hero of Fable, but this led to a lot of heroes simply disappearing to get away from everyone, and then still others were killed when regular citizens burnt down the Guild of Heroes, that ultimately saw heroes themselves fading into obscurity. And in the absence of that, science and technology has prevailed, fast-forwarding the world of Albion from like the medieval era to more like a colonial period, which is why we have things like firearms in this one. Now, with that in mind, as a child, we are an orphan of sorts living on the streets of Bowerstone, simply wishing for things to get better, and we find ourselves confronted by a merchant claiming to sell magical things like a music box that can grant a wish, which is more or less confirmed by Teresa herself showing up, our sister from the original game, who prods the children into actually buying the thing. Once we do, nothing happens, but later on that night, guards come to collect you and your sister to bring you to Castle Fairfax, the location of your wish. You wish to live there. So you think it's coming true, but when you show up, it turns out that Lucian, the king of the castle, has other plans. And when he confirms that with the music box and a guild seal on the ground that you two are in fact descendants of the heroes of old, he kills your sister and attempts to kill you. But you, of course, live, raised by Teresa after this, and when you grow up, you just so happen to be ready to set out on your own and take your revenge while making a name for yourself. This quickly leads into a story where you meet Teresa in the Guild of Heroes, where you learn of your own blood and everything, before heading off to Bowerstone to meet her again, where we learn of Lucian's plans. After he attempted to kill you, he fled, or simply left, to an area called the Tattered Spire, which he is currently trying to build with the remnants of old technology. And when he does this and succeeds, he'll be able to grant himself a wish, fundamentally altering the fabric of reality any which way he sees fit. Now, in order to stop him, we have to gather 3 heroes. The hero of strength, will, and skill, respectively. Now, 2 of these are pretty irrelevant, and they're only around for this game, which are Hammer and Garth, the masters of strength and will, respectively. They have some cool quests associated, but Reaver's probably the one you want to keep in mind the most, the last one you'll be picking up right before the game ends, because Reaver is a bad person, let's say. It's heavily implied that he's the person who destroyed Oakvale, but he's made some sort of deal with what they call the Shadow Court, and he sends people there to be robbed of their vitality in exchange for prolonging his own, and he reappears in the 3rd game. He tries to betray us before being betrayed himself, which leads to him finally agreeing to help us, albeit a bit briefly. And that leads to the finale of the game, where rather than anything traditional like a last boss or anything, we simply have a confrontation with Lucian where we just press like 1 or 2 buttons and that's it, before being granted the idea of a wish, by of course commandeering the spire. After you were trapped there earlier and time skipped to see it built to begin with, during which you rescued Garth from captivity. And while I would say much of the game's story is decent to okay, they really flub the ending pretty bad, especially with the rewards, which is a consistent problem this game has all throughout. The rewards of this game are just skewed. Either they're incredibly disproportionate to the effort involved, or they're just straight up not good to begin with, no matter how you slice it. And that's really exemplified here at the ending, where your options are basically resurrect everyone who died besides your family, resurrect your family, or give yourself a bunch of gold. The gold is useless for reasons we'll get into. Saving everyone changes nothing, but it's a nice gesture, and then saving your family and loved ones is the only one with a real tangible benefit, because this resurrects the dog companion that has been traveling with you the entire time and is helpful for locating things as well as aiding you in combat. So realistically, of these options, the only one with a tangible benefit outside of story reasons is that option, which is honestly pretty incredibly boring. But let's talk about a few things involved in the story that I did think were cool and were better than I remembered. So right away though, it's important to mention that throughout this, difficulty-wise, there's not much to speak of. The game just has the one option, and simply put, the game is not complex enough to really pose much of a challenge, so there is that. And that's especially notable here because this game doesn't really have much in the way of boss fights, though there are 1 or 2 enemies that serve as like pseudo-bosses, including one that is towards the end called the Great Shard, and some of these fights have like little mechanics and things, but you'd be hard pressed to call them a boss simply because of how straightforward and relatively easy they are, frankly. Which is one of the reasons I think this game really struggles with properly rewarding the player, because they never really present you with a proper challenge anyway, and the things that take the most time investment rarely give you a reward worthwhile even if you do them. But another thing to note about running through this game and the story is the big time skip. So about halfway through the game you become imprisoned in the Spire, this time as a guard at least, but you cannot leave and you wind up spending 10 years of your life here. After you finish this quest, the world outside fundamentally changes, including based a little bit on your actions. Now you get a taste of this at the beginning of the game, where depending on whether or not you helped criminals or the guards, the state of Bowerstone Old Town is quite a bit different. Now here, after the second time skip, it's even more pronounced because a lot of the maps change in pretty substantial ways. In fact, if you invested in the rough and tumble town of Westcliff, you'll come back to find it prospering. Oakfield, which is just a couple of buildings when you first go to it, becomes a whole little village after this, and seeing some of those impacts you could have are pretty neat, even if they are relatively few in number. But it's still an interesting concept to play around with in a game like this, and I simply wish they would have focused more on those aspects rather than simply mirroring the first game's story basically wherever they could. So simply put, while the story isn't like abysmal in my opinion, I would say it simply focuses on the wrong stuff and it rehashes too much, seemingly almost out of fear of doing anything too drastically different. But that brings us to our progression systems. Now, progression in this game is interesting because there are parts of it that I like and things that are fun to play around with in Fable 2 specifically, and there are other parts of it that I think they gutted and are worse as a result. So as an example, as I mentioned earlier, armor is cosmetic here. In fact, there's really only one thing in the entire game I would legitimately consider armor, and it's from a DLC, but even it is, again, purely cosmetic. There are no armor values or anything like that. It's simply more social-oriented stats like how attractive or scary, etc. you look in any given suit of armor. Or clothing might be a better descriptor. But our main bit of progression is experience, of course. As we use the various styles of combat, we'll gain experience as we use them. This can be for the three modes, melee, ranged, and magic, though for some reason they swapped the color coding for melee and magic in this one. Melee is blue and magic is red for whatever reason. And then of course green is just general experience, and you'll spend a combination of these on the appropriate abilities of each type until you've maxed them out, which is going to increase things like your attack speed, your damage with melee or ranged weapons respectively, the spells you know, etc. But there's a few things to know about this system right away. Melee and ranged fundamentally remain the same with some small changes, but magic in particular they gutted. In fact, there's only I believe it's a third of the spells that were available in the original title, and the ones that are here use a fundamentally different system than the original, which was more of a hotkey system where you pressed a button and the magic happened, at the cost of will. Well, in this game, in addition to not having more spells to cast generally, we also simply don't have a mana bar or anything. Rather, we use a charge system. So as you unlock higher levels of spells, you unlock a similar level of charge. So a level 1 spell unlocks your ability to use that spell at all, and then level 2 lets you charge a spell up to level 2, level 3, etc. Now you can swap out which spell is assigned to each level of charge, and you determine which one you use at which level by how long you hold down the magic button. Now, every spell of the 8 that are available has 2 different modes: a single target mode and an AoE version. Single target you activate by pushing your movement towards that character and then simply hitting the magic button, and then the AoE you don't press anything, you simply charge up your magic. But what really gets me here is simply the reduced number of spells you are able to learn, which limits how they interact with the other modes of gameplay, such as the multi-arrow or multi-attack option spells, which I miss myself. But it's not all bad. We do have some fun bits of progression. For starters, our dog. We get a dog right at the start of the game who follows us throughout the rest of it, despite that not being how time works at all. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that dog is magic. Which might just be worth mentioning because we can actually train this dog. There are a couple of different books that you can use to teach it tricks, as well as improve its ability to find treasure, which are places you can dig up for loot, or to find treasure chests at greater distances, and then you can also train it to help you fight more in combat as well. So that's one form of progression. And then the other part of that is your weapons and augments. So one thing that didn't really change much from the original is that there are, of course, different weapons we can have. Ranged and melee weapons, of course. There are a bunch of different types of each, with the addition of firearms replacing bows from the original. So this time around we have crossbows and we have guns. Melee weapons didn't change too much. There's a bunch of different types, each with their own benefits and detriments, attack speeds, etc. So there's a decent amount of room there to find something you enjoy. But the guns and crossbows in particular are noteworthy because depending on which type you buy, they fire a bit differently. For instance, you can buy things like repeater crossbows or clockwork versions of guns that shoot multiple rounds before needing to be reloaded. And if you pick up some abilities, you can even start to sub-target individual parts of an enemy's body, allowing you to make specific hits on them. So for enemies like hollow men, you can actually destroy their limbs and stuff, which I thought was a neat little addition. Now, all of those weapons, if they come with augment slots, can be augmented by enchantments, more or less, that you can pick up throughout the game. These are much more interesting now. Augments in the original were just like add fire damage or something like that, whereas these tend to be here's a bonus and potentially a detriment or something that interacts with the other systems of the game. For instance, you can add, like, say, lightning damage to your weapon, but it might come at the expense of causing your character to be scarred over time. There are weapons that will give you more experience at the cost of damage. There are augments that will give you more damage at the cost of draining your health down to a certain point. So they do a lot of fun stuff with those enchantments that I think something like the first game really could have used. But all of that really is in service of what the game calls character morphing more broadly, and this is how your character changes over time, because character creation is simply choosing either a boy or a girl. But as we advance all these little metrics of our progression systems, our character is going to change. Leveling up melee and strength is going to make your character physically bigger, and that one specifically can be a little bit of a problem because it makes every character absolutely jacked like a bodybuilder in a way that can be, let's say, less than flattering should your character eat too much food, because another aspect of this is being either skinny or large, and depending on what your character eats, you'll be affected by this, and food is much more prevalent in this game because potions are a bit more scarce unless you're buying them, which means a lot of characters can wind up looking pretty much the same. But investing into skill will make your character taller, and investing into will and learning spells will slowly cause your character to start to glow with their power, and you can get more scarred up over time, etc. So there's lots of little ways all of those things affect your character's appearance as a form of progression and kind of showing your journey. Though one of the DLCs introduces a bunch of ways to control this specifically, and through things like potions, etc., you can have a bit more control over how your character looks should you want it. But then of course there's the classic good and evil, and even that's been expanded with corruption and purity this time around. So how good or evil you are and the choices you make involving that, including things like having affairs or jacking up everybody's rent, will ultimately change your character's appearance and see you either growing horns or developing a halo, being swarmed by flies down to straight up the complexion of your skin and the color of your hair, which I would say is one of the more charming aspects of what the Fable series has to offer. But that brings us to the gameplay and world section. So, compared to Fable 1, Fable 2 has less but larger explorable areas. There's not a ton of these. In fact, I think there's only like 15 if you go like just a complete one-to-one count. But they're all much larger than the explorable areas of Fable. And just like Fable, they can be mostly divided up into areas that have a settlement and areas that do not, because you have all sorts of ways to interact with, especially the non-combat areas of the game this time around. They really expanded a lot of those features, and it's likely going to be the thing you do the most of. Now, Fable 1 saw us interacting with people via what they call expressions, which makes a return here, but they're basically just emotes. Now, this system has been expanded upon a great deal, meaning that there are a bunch of values and attributes that determine how characters react to you based on things like how scary you might be, how ugly or attractive they think your character is, how famous you are, etc. And you can play into that via all of your expressions and sort of talking up everyone you meet, and each of those individual characters has a few different stats that you can toggle and ways to interact with them. Now, probably the most basic is that you can get married and have children, or multiple families if you prefer, but you can also get citizens to do other things, like just follow you around, where you can lead them into danger, or even take them on dates, get them drunk, make them dance, laugh, etc. And they can even give you gifts and whatnot if they approve of you enough. And all these changes to this system in particular makes it easier to interact with these characters right out of the gate, as opposed to having to wait a bit in Fable 1 before your character started to really make a name for themselves. Now, one way in particular you can interact with this system a lot is by buying up property. So in the original game, you had to kill the owner of a property in order to buy it, whereas here, most everything is available for sale at some point or another. And what's more, you can do more than just buy most buildings. Now, some buildings simply are what they are, and some are unique and can't be sold afterwards, things like that. But you can buy them and then either move in there yourself, which has its own benefits, or you can choose to rent it out, which earns you money every 5 minutes, which is pooled with things like the shops you buy and own, etc. So you'll make money every so often, and it can get to the point where you're raking in like 15 grand every few minutes, which is one of the reasons some of the rewards of this game are inconsequential, because you can build an entire real estate empire in this game that sees you with more money than you could ever spend. And it's quite easy to do, frankly. But houses and the like can actually be renovated. You can go to furniture stores in the game, buy up fancy furniture to replace in a home, and then you can either sell it for a profit if you wanted to, or simply collect increased rent. You can set the prices of shops and the amount of rent you are charging, which contributes to your corruption or purity accordingly, and all sorts of other fun stuff. Now, a reason you might want to move into a home for yourself is that each home comes with bonuses when you rest there that affect certain stats, and because potions are so much more scarce, you might often find yourself resting, and you can move your families into any of these homes. And depending on how well you treat your wife and kids and how often you visit, you might find yourself divorced, you might initiate a divorce, you might murder your spouse by donating them, let's say, to the Temple of Shadows where they get sacrificed, so on and so forth. So my favorite thing about Fable 2 really is just all of the different ways you can interact with its citizens and the environment in just really fun, unique ways that even today hasn't exactly been matched, at least in that specific regard, as let's be honest, a lot of these are feeling a bit dated these days. But those are not the only things you can get up to in Fable 2, and that's kind of where the problem comes in, because everything else I'm about to mention has a huge problem with rewarding the player, and that's because it is very, very easy to get everything you could ever want simply by buying up property and collecting cash every few minutes to buy up more property until you own everything in the entire game and you're raking in tens of thousands of gold every 5 minutes. At which point you can buy absolutely everything there is to buy, which means the only things that could possibly be substantial rewards are anything that is unique, and that is where the game starts to struggle with things like its silver keys, demon doors, and the gargoyles. Oftentimes, the rewards for those things is simply not worth the effort, or it winds up being gold that you do not need. So let's start with the silver keys. Silver keys are used to unlock silver chests based on how many you have. Now, total, I think there's like 52, but the game only requires you to collect 50 in order to get all the rewards. However, most of the silver chests only require you to have 20 or less keys. There is a complete lack of chests that require you to have the 20 to 49 amount. There is one chest available after you beat the game that requires 50 silver keys to open. And do you know what's in that chest? 50,000 gold. But the kicker is, you cannot get to that chest. It is physically not available to you until after you've beaten the game and already been offered 1 million gold. In fact, you're still not done, because after that you then have to go buy Castle Fairfax, which is only available after you beat the game and itself costs 1 million gold. So they put a 50,000 gold reward behind a $1 million buyout and an extreme fetch quest of 50 keys. The reward simply does not match the effort. Then we have gargoyles. New to Fable 2, you can find these little gargoyle statues around and shoot them, and every 10 that you destroy, you can go to the Gargoyle Trove, a secret area of Bowerstone Market, to get a reward. Some of these are decent, like a Potion of Life, but once you've found and destroyed all of them, which once again requires you to have beaten the game, you get a pretty good unique crossbow. The only unique crossbow in the game, in fact. But again, we get this reward after the game is over, and it's not even the best of its nature. There are much better ranged weapons than this, and it is, again, hidden behind a long quest. Then we have the demon doors. I love the idea of demon doors. Big talking stone door, you have to go up and do something to make it happy in order for it to let you through. This can be basically anything under the sun. Following expressions, bringing in an audience so it can tell a story, dressing in a certain way, having a certain amount of personality points for a certain thing, solving a riddle, just all sorts of fun little stuff. And again, the rewards behind most of these doors are garbage, and the last one, which requires you to have opened all of the others, rewards you, yet again, with 50,000 gold. The reward system of this game is simply not good, and it really drags down the rest of the experience because it means oftentimes you are putting in effort for something, and the only thing you get is gold you likely already have, in fact, to the point of being less than like 10 minutes worth of gold after you've built up your real estate empire. So it just feels ridiculous after a while. So there's things I like about it and things I clearly do not. But let's move on to the combat section of this video. Combat is of course divided up into melee, ranged, and magic. Melee they improved from the first game, but it's still not great. So in the original game, the problem with melee was that you could block, but every single enemy's attack animation was so fast that you simply could not reactively block anything. The only way you were going to block something is if you were already blocking. And this game sets about kind of changing that, but then it swarms you with enemies towards the end and kind of runs into the same problem where you just can't see half the time. But they've also added things like counters and parries, that kind of thing. So it's a little more interesting, but not much. Ranged, on the other hand, like I mentioned, has guns with different kinds of things that can affect it, like, how many times can you shoot that weapon before reloading, what the range of it is, depending on your skills, you can target individual body parts even, and I liked a lot of that, but it's still a pretty basic system, especially on console where you have the controller that you have to aim with, which is simply not going to be as accurate as a mouse. And then there's the magic system. The magic system I do not like, but I see how some people could. The charge system simply is not for me. I like the magic system of the original game, especially because all of those spells they cut from the magic system and how they interacted with the other styles of combat, like ranged and melee, really feels like you lost something in the interim. Not being able to do things like assassin rush into a multi-attack melee hit, making you feel like a battle mage, is a bummer. Now they still have some fun stuff, and a fully charged up AoE feels really strong, and the more magic you get, the more quickly you can charge some of this stuff up as well, but it always feels like you're trying to balance being hit with doing something cool, which is hard to do because the game loves to outnumber you with what is, in my opinion, not really a system that handles that sheer number of enemies very well. Now, I fully admit the original game also really favored a jack-of-all-trades approach here, where you are going to get so much experience at a certain point that you're just going to be this huge overpowered monstrosity and there's not going to be much of a build to speak of, but they took what little bit of that was there and kind of just got rid of it in 2, which I think is especially noteworthy for bosses or moments or puzzles where you simply have to engage with like hitting the exact weak point on a troll to deal any damage at all, as opposed to being able to use all sorts of combat styles to fight them in the first game. And that, combined with how they changed the armor system, makes the game feel less like an RPG to me and more like just a simple action adventure. Though I will say combat, as I recall, was never the strong point of any of these games, but rather its side systems and how it blended in with everything else. So, long story short, I think combat is generally a little more focused here, and as a result, probably a better experience for most people, but I still don't think it's very good, frankly, especially compared to anything these days. But that brings me to the DLC. Now, if you are streaming these, you still actually have to pay for the DLC if you're playing this over on Game Pass, as it does not come with the DLCs. So I did have to pay for both of these, and these are See the Future and Not Whole Island. Now, See the Future is a few unique quests, and then after the game you can get some intense foreshadowing for Fable 3. Honestly, not incredible, not bad. They're pretty good little quests you can take on that see you cleansing some cursed items that you buy from the merchant at the beginning of the game who sold you the music box. Overall, it's decent. Now, much better was one that I honestly don't remember having played ever, and that was Knothole Island. Knothole Island catches you up with the residents of Knothole Glade from the original game and what became of them over the centuries, and it sees you being called to an island to help out with a local weather crisis where people need you to go interact with some totems in a shrine to change the weather on the island, which used to be done by the warriors of the island, but they all died, and so they need help. You're going to do this a couple of different times until you've retrieved 3 totems and experienced 3 different weather events, and after this is done, you can start to do this at will, changing and exploring the island as you see fit. And it's an interesting concept that I enjoy well enough, but really the great thing about this DLC is simply the rewards. You get the only thing in the game that could actually be considered real armor, even if it is just cosmetic, as well as access to all sorts of potions and stuff that allow you to directly interface with the stats that make up how your character looks, like so you can make them thinner or bigger, remove scars, change how tall they are, etc. And there is a shop here that you can sort of barter things for, unique rewards like weapons and stuff, and it's a lot of unique things, so that was fun to interact with. And I enjoyed the Knothole Island DLC quite a bit, more than I thought I would, as that was fun to mess around with. Now, normally this is where I would cover how the game ran on the Steam Deck, but as I was streaming this, I'm not going to be doing all that. I'm sure it's probably possible, but seems like a lot of hoops to jump through at that point, to be blunt about it. Which brings me to the positives and negatives before we start wrapping this thing up. So on the positive side for me, I would say Fable 2 really nailed like interacting with the world and improving a lot of those systems from the original game. There's just so many different ways to mess with the villagers or buy up all the property and be as evil or as pure of heart as your heart desires. And that really is where a game like this shines the absolute most. And that, combined with seeing the world change over time, even in response to a few of your own actions, gives you a much clearer picture of how you, as a hero, are having a very direct impact on the world around you and how you are viewed by its denizens. And while even here in Fable 2, the execution can feel a little sloppy and janky, the concept of it is wonderful. Though that brings me to my negatives. First and foremost, as I mentioned, the reward structure for this game is just all wrong. There's these huge quest lines that reward you essentially nothing because the reward is so useless that it might as well be nothing. And then things like simply walking and waiting to buy up property grants you access to everything you could ever ask for. And it's clear that obviously more balancing needed to be put into that because it's just a mess. And that reward structure, combined with the terrible ending and the removal of the very few RPG mechanics that were in the first game to begin with, that really saw you kind of building your own character rather than a sort of just jack of all trades being removed, winds up making Fable 2 feel like a very mixed bag to me. So all of that brings me to my conclusion for Fable 2. Looking back at this one, it's a real mixed bag. On one hand, I do think it's a little better than my memory of it led me to believe, as I realistically only remembered the parts I hated, to be honest, which were things like the magic system, the gutted RPG systems, and I simply forgot all of the things that were really fun to mess around with, like how interesting it was to interact with all these NPCs and everything. But I think Fable 2 is also a very clear turning point for the series in a few different ways, because they took Fable 1 and lessened what it could have been in favor of mass appeal via things like, again, changing it more to an action adventure, which leaned into more superficial elements that were kind of funny to engage with for a little bit, but as a result lacked any real depth to them, making Fable 2 an extremely superficial game. And there are parts of that that are really fun to engage with, which is why I would have to imagine that the game was extremely well critically received when it launched back in 2008. But as a result of that, at the same time, I also don't think this game has stood the test of time. It feels extremely dated in a lot of ways, but it also, weirdly enough, makes me a bit hopeful for the reboot, especially because I think if you take some of the ideas at play here and then turn them into more fully realized and thought out systems, you'd be onto something really special. But in any event, when it comes to playing Fable 2, realistically, if at this point in your life you haven't, you're probably better off simply watching a video like this, because while while even today I think it has its fun moments, I don't think it really stood the test of time. Which is where I'm going to leave this particular video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. I'm still going to be reviewing Fable 3, which did see a PC release. I've already got it installed and all sorted out, even though that was a headache. So I will be reviewing that one at some point if you're curious about the final entry in the series, but that's going to do it for this video and this look back at Fable 2. So do be sure to let me know how you feel about this one down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.